The cruelest thing about regret is that it always arrives dressed like confidence. Ethan Calloway stood beneath the gold crystal lights of the Crown Meridian Ballroom with one hand inside the pocket of his tailored black tuxedo, while Sydney's elite laughed around him with glasses of imported champagne balanced between polished fingers. The city glittered behind the floor-to-ceiling windows like a sea of diamonds. Ferries moved slowly across the harbor below. Cameras flashed every few seconds. Somewhere near the orchestra stage, a woman laughed too loudly at something one of the investors said, but Ethan barely heard any of it. His attention stayed fixed on the glowing phone screen in his palm. One message. That was all he had sent her after 6 years of silence. Or something elegant. If you still own anything elegant. Even now, staring at the words again, he could feel the sharp satisfaction they had given him earlier that morning. Cold. Precise. Surgical. The kind of sentence a man sends when he wants to prove he stopped caring years ago. But the truth was simpler than that. Men only try to humiliate the women they never truly forget. You really think she'll come? Sebastian Mercer asked beside him, adjusting the cufflinks on his Navy suit. Ethan slipped the phone away. Clara always hated disappointing people. Sebastian smirked. That sounds almost affectionate. Ethan ignored him. Across the ballroom, executives from Callaway Holdings moved between politicians, celebrities, and investors beneath warm amber lighting, while waiters carried trays of oysters and truffle canapes through the crowd. Everything about the evening screamed power, wealth, control. The annual Callaway Foundation Gala had become one of the most exclusive events in Australia over the last 5 years, and Ethan knew exactly what tonight represented. Reputation. That was the only currency the rich feared losing. 6 years ago, Clara Whitmore had almost destroyed his. At least, that was the version of the story everyone still believed. I heard she lives somewhere up the coast now. One woman whispered nearby. Probably struggling. Wasn't she a model before the scandal? Another replied. Such a waste. Ethan took a slow sip of whiskey as the voices drifted through the room like smoke. Scandal. Funny word. It sounded glamorous when wealthy people said it. But what it really meant was public humiliation with expensive lighting. He still remembered the headlines. Ethan Callaway's fiancée caught with rival executive. Socialite betrayal rocks billion-dollar empire. The media had fed on Clara for months. Every photograph of her became evidence. Every silence became guilt. And Ethan had done the one thing he now hated himself for most. He had stayed silent too. Not because he fully believed the accusations, but because protecting the company felt more urgent than protecting the woman he loved. His jaw tightened at the memory. Earth to billionaire, Sebastian muttered. You're staring at the entrance like a man waiting for a ghost. Ethan loosened his tie slightly. I'm not waiting for anyone. But his eyes never left the ballroom doors. At exactly 7:42 p.m., his assistant approached carefully through the crowd. Mr. Callaway, she said softly, Miss Whitmore has arrived. The room didn't change immediately. The music continued. Glasses clinked. Conversations floated beneath the chandeliers. But something invisible shifted in Ethan's chest. A tension. A pull. Like the air before a storm reaches the water. Sebastian grinned under his breath. Well, this should be entertaining. Ethan turned toward the entrance just as the massive doors slowly opened. For one strange second, nobody reacted. Then conversations began fading one by one. Clara Whitmore stepped into the ballroom, wearing a simple ivory dress that fell softly to her ankles. No diamonds. No designer logos. No dramatic entrance. Yet somehow every woman in couture suddenly looked overdressed beside her. Her blonde hair rested in loose waves over one shoulder, and the warm light caught against her pale skin like candlelight against porcelain. She looked older than she had 6 years ago. Not weaker, just quieter, like someone who had survived a storm nobody else could hear. But Ethan barely noticed the dress, or the silence swallowing the room, because 2 small children walked beside her holding her hands. A little boy on her left, a little girl on her right. Twins. The boy looked up first, blue eyes scanning the ballroom with cautious curiosity, while the little girl stayed closer against Clara's side. Ethan felt something inside him stop moving. Completely. Around him, whispers spread instantly through the crowd. Are those her children? She has twins. How old are they? Clara finally lifted her eyes toward him across the ballroom. Calm. Steady. No anger. No fear. Somehow that hurt more than hatred ever could. Ethan forced himself to move forward, every polished shoe step echoing louder than the orchestra in his head. The crowd parted automatically for him. Years of power had trained people to make room when Ethan Callaway walked toward something. But tonight, for the first time in years, he felt strangely unsure of himself. As he approached, the little boy stared directly at him. Ethan's breath caught. Those eyes. God. The child had his eyes. Mom. The boy whispered softly, tugging Clara's hand. Is that him? Clara's fingers tightened around the child's small hand for half a second before she answered quietly. Yes, Noah. That's Ethan. Ethan stopped walking. The noise in the ballroom disappeared into a dull blur. He looked from Noah to the little girl beside Clara. Same blonde hair. Same pale skin. Same impossible blue eyes staring back at him beneath the ballroom lights. A strange pressure rose into his chest, so suddenly, it almost felt physical. Sebastian walked up behind him slowly, his usual confidence gone. Ethan, he muttered carefully. But Ethan couldn't answer. Because 6 years ago, Clara Whitmore had walked out of his life without taking anything from him. Or at least that was what he had believed. Tonight, standing in front of 2 children who looked painfully familiar beneath the golden chandelier light, Ethan Callaway realized the most expensive mistake of his life had never cost him money. It had cost him time. There are moments in life when a room full of people suddenly becomes too quiet, and Ethan Callaway felt it now with painful clarity. Nobody touched their champagne. Nobody laughed anymore. Even the orchestra near the marble staircase seemed uncertain, the violin melody fading awkwardly beneath the weight of confusion spreading through the ballroom. Ethan stared at the twins standing beside Clara while his heartbeat thudded heavily against his ribs. The little girl held tightly onto Clara's hand, hiding partially behind her mother's ivory dress. But the boy continued watching Ethan with calm curiosity, completely unaware that one look from him had just shattered 6 years of carefully constructed emotional armor. Ethan finally forced himself to speak. You have children. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. Too low. Too careful. Clara nodded once. Yes. Nothing more. No dramatic reveal. No bitterness. That frightened him more than anger would have. People only become that calm after surviving disappointment for a very long time. Sebastian cleared his throat beside him. Perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere private. Clara glanced around the ballroom at the dozens of wealthy strangers openly staring at her children like they were part of the evening entertainment. Her expression never changed, but Ethan noticed the subtle way she shifted slightly closer to the twins, protective without making a scene. No, Clara said softly. You invited me publicly. I assumed that meant you preferred an audience. Several guests immediately looked away in embarrassment. Ethan felt heat crawl into his chest. She had always done that. Clara never raised her voice. She simply told the truth in a way that made other people ashamed of themselves. Noah tilted his head slightly while studying Ethan's face. Mom said you used to know her before we were born. Ethan looked at the boy again. Every second became more unsettling. The child's eyes were identical to his own. Not similar. Identical. Even the shape of his eyebrows mirrored photographs Ethan had seen of himself as a child. A cold wave of realization slowly moved through him, but his mind still resisted it. Because if the truth forming in front of him was real, then 6 years of his life suddenly looked very different. How old are they? Ethan asked quietly. Clara answered without hesitation. 6. The number landed like glass breaking somewhere deep inside him. 6 years. Exactly 6 years since the night Clara disappeared from Sydney after the scandal destroyed her reputation. Ethan swallowed hard and loosened his tie again, suddenly unable to breathe comfortably beneath the ballroom lights. Around them, whispers multiplied rapidly through the crowd. The timing matches. Surely not. They look exactly like him. Did he not know? Ethan barely heard any of it. His attention remained locked on Clara. She looked tired beneath the elegant calm she carried so naturally now. Not physically exhausted. Life exhausted. The kind of weariness that comes from carrying pain privately for years because there is nobody safe enough to hand it to. And for the first time in a very long while, Ethan hated himself for being the reason behind that look in her eyes. You should not have brought them here, he muttered finally. Clara's expression softened slightly, though not with affection. More like disappointment. I almost did not. Her voice remained gentle. But Noah wanted to meet the man from the photographs. Ethan's chest tightened again. Photographs. Before Clara could answer, Lily suddenly looked up at Ethan with cautious curiosity. Mom says you built buildings. A few nervous laughs escaped nearby guests, desperate for relief from the tension suffocating the room. Ethan looked down at the little girl. Sometimes, he answered quietly. Lily nodded seriously, as if evaluating this information carefully. Noah builds things too. Mostly dinosaurs. Noah rolled his eyes immediately. That was one time. The innocence in their small argument cut through Ethan harder than any accusation could have. Children that age were supposed to argue about toys and cartoons, not stand inside a luxury ballroom surrounded by strangers while unknowingly exposing the worst mistake of a billionaire's life. Ethan suddenly became aware of how absurd the entire evening looked through Clara's eyes. Crystal chandeliers, $100,000 watches, women in couture gowns pretending not to gossip while absolutely gossiping, men who measured human value through stock prices, and private jets. And in the middle of it all stood Clara Whitmore in a simple ivory dress that probably cost less than the wine being served tonight, somehow carrying more dignity than everyone else combined. Sebastian stepped closer carefully. Perhaps we should get the children something to eat. Clara immediately shook her head. We will not stay long. Ethan looked at her sharply. You just arrived, and now you know the truth. That sentence hit him harder than she intended, or perhaps exactly as hard as she intended. Ethan studied her face carefully, trying to find traces of the woman he once knew. The ambitious blonde model who used to dance barefoot in his kitchen at midnight while old rock music played through the apartment speakers. The woman who once told him expensive houses felt colder than small ones because rich people forgot how to fill silence properly. Back then, Ethan had laughed at her philosophy. Now he stood inside a ballroom worth millions and had never felt lonelier in his life. Why did you never tell me? He asked finally, the question escaping before pride could stop it. Clara looked at him for several seconds. Not angry, not emotional, just tired. Would you have listened? Ethan opened his mouth, but no answer came. Because 6 years ago, the truthful answer would have been no. Back then, he trusted lawyers more than love, reputation more than loyalty, evidence more than instinct. He remembered the endless meetings after the scandal exploded across every media outlet in the country. Investors threatening to pull funding, board members demanding damage control, advisors insisting Clara needed to disappear publicly before she destroyed the company image further. And Ethan? God. Ethan had let them convince him silence was necessary. Clara looked away from him toward the harbor lights beyond the ballroom windows. I came tonight because your message made something very clear. Her voice stayed calm, but Ethan could hear the sadness beneath it now. You still believe I was the villain in your story. The orchestra resumed softly somewhere behind them, but the music only made the silence between their words feel heavier. Noah tugged gently on Clara's hand. Mom, can we go home soon? Clara brushed her fingers through his blonde hair carefully. Soon, sweetheart. Ethan stared at the child again. Home. The word echoed painfully inside him because suddenly he realized something unbearable. For 6 years, Clara had built a home without him. Birthdays, bedtime stories, school mornings, Christmas mornings, lost teeth, fevers, nightmares, first words, first steps. Entire years of life had happened while he sat in boardrooms, believing success could replace happiness. And judging by the way Noah instinctively leaned closer to Clara whenever strangers stared too long, Ethan understood another painful truth too. Whatever life Clara had given these children, it had been filled with love. Enough love that they still looked safe in the world despite everything she must have endured alone. The strange thing about guilt was that it did not arrive all at once. It arrived in pieces. A child's eyes. A familiar smile. A question you should have asked years ago. Ethan stood motionless near the center of the ballroom, while conversations quietly resumed around him, though now every voice sounded careful, restrained, uncertain where to look. Sydney's most powerful people suddenly behaved like guests at a funeral, pretending not to stare at the coffin. Clara remained calm beside the twins, but Ethan noticed the exhaustion beginning to settle behind her eyes. Noah leaned lightly against her side, while Lily held onto the sleeve of her dress with sleepy fingers. They should not have been here this late. They should have been home in pajamas, arguing about bedtime stories and brushing their teeth. Instead, they stood inside a room full of strangers because Ethan had sent one cruel message out of pride. A waiter approached carefully with a silver tray of sparkling water. Clara thanked him softly before handing one glass to Noah and another to Lily first. She did not even touch one herself. Ethan watched the small gesture quietly. Mothers always served everyone else before themselves. Somehow that detail hurt more than the revelation itself. "There is a private lounge upstairs," Ethan said finally. "The children can rest there for a while." Clara looked at him cautiously. "We are fine." "Clara." He lowered his voice slightly. "Please." The word surprised even him. Ethan Calloway rarely asked anyone for anything politely. But tonight, standing in front of the woman he once loved and two children who carried his face without carrying his name, arrogance suddenly felt useless. Clara hesitated for several seconds before nodding once. Ethan guided them through the ballroom while guests pretended not to watch. But he could feel their attention following every step. The mighty CEO exposed in front of his own empire. Noah glanced around curiously at the massive chandeliers above them. "This place is bigger than our supermarket." Ethan almost smiled despite himself. "It is probably more expensive too." Noah considered that seriously. "That is a bit silly." Sebastian coughed suddenly beside them, clearly hiding laughter. Ethan looked down at the boy again. God, even his honesty sounded familiar. Upstairs, the private lounge overlooked Sydney Harbor through wide glass walls glowing with reflections from the water below. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and expensive leather. Ethan opened the door quietly while Clara guided the twins inside. Lily immediately climbed onto the large cream sofa, exhausted from the evening. Noah wandered toward the windows instead, pressing his hands lightly against the glass while watching ferries move across the dark water below. "Are those boats?" he asked. "Ferries," Ethan answered automatically. "They cross the harbor every day." Noah nodded with fascination. "Mom says Sydney looks prettier at night because rich people turn on all the lights." Ethan glanced toward Clara. She looked embarrassed for the first time all evening. "I did not mean it like that." "No," Ethan said quietly. "You were right." Silence settled gently through the room after that. Not hostile, just unfamiliar. Like three separate lives accidentally colliding after years apart. Clara carefully removed Lily's small shoes once the little girl curled up against the sofa cushions. The tenderness in the movement made Ethan look away briefly. 6 years. 6 years she had done everything. Alone. School lunches. Fevers. Rent payments. Nightmares. Christmas mornings. He could not stop thinking about it now. Every missed moment pressed heavier against his chest. Noah turned from the windows suddenly. "Mom says you used to make pancakes badly." Clara closed her eyes for half a second in quiet embarrassment while Sebastian laughed openly near the doorway. Ethan stared at Noah. "She told you that. You burned them once." Noah continued confidently. And then the smoke alarm went off. Ethan actually smiled this time before he could stop himself. A real smile. Small but genuine. "That happened one time." Clara folded her arms softly. 3 times. Their eyes met for a brief second, and something old flickered painfully between them. Not romance exactly. Memory. The dangerous kind that reminds two people who they used to be before life became difficult. Sebastian glanced carefully between them before stepping toward the door. "I should probably return downstairs before the board members start inventing conspiracy theories." Ethan barely looked at him. "Cancel my remaining meetings tomorrow." Sebastian blinked. "You had 4 investor breakfasts scheduled. Cancel them." Sebastian studied him for a moment before nodding quietly. "Understood." After he left, silence returned again. Softer now. Ethan loosened his cufflinks slowly while Clara sat beside Lily on the sofa. Noah continued examining the harbor lights with fascination. "Do you live here?" the boy asked suddenly. "Not exactly," Ethan answered. "I have an apartment nearby." Noah looked impressed. "With windows this big?" "Bigger." Clara gave Ethan a look that clearly warned him not to encourage unnecessary billionaire behavior. Ethan almost laughed again. It startled him how natural this felt despite everything broken between them. Like his body still remembered how to exist near her even when his pride did not know what to do anymore. "Noah," Clara said gently, "do not ask too many questions." "It is all right," Ethan replied quietly. "I do not mind." But Clara's expression changed slightly at his words. Something fragile moved behind her eyes. "That is new." Ethan felt the truth of that. Immediately. Years ago, he had always been too busy, too distracted, too focused on expansion deals, shareholder meetings, media appearances. Clara used to joke that his calendar received more attention than she did. Back then, he laughed instead of listening. Now, every old conversation returned like unpaid debt. Lily stirred softly against the sofa cushions before opening sleepy blue eyes. She looked toward Ethan for several seconds with quiet curiosity. Mom cries when she sees you on television sometimes. The room became completely still. Clara's face lost color instantly. Lily, what? The little girl asked innocently. You do. Ethan looked at Clara slowly, but she avoided his eyes entirely now. Her fingers tightened together in her lap. The city lights reflected softly across the glass walls around them, while silence pressed painfully through the room. Ethan swallowed hard. Why? Clara gave a faint, tired smile without looking up. Because some losses stay expensive no matter how much time passes. The answer settled deep inside him with unbearable weight. And for the first time since Clara walked back into his life tonight, Ethan understood something terrifying. He had spent 6 years believing she abandoned him. But sitting here now beside the woman who still cried quietly when she saw him on television, he realized the possibility that had never once crossed his arrogant mind before. Maybe Clara Whitmore had never stopped loving him either. Money could buy silence from strangers, but it could never silence memory. Ethan stood near the glass windows overlooking the harbor while Noah pressed both palms against the cool surface beside him, watching the fairy lights drift slowly across the dark water below. Somewhere downstairs, the gala continued without him. Investors were probably searching for explanations. Board members were probably whispering in corners. Reporters were likely refreshing their phones already, desperate for details about the woman and 2 children who had just shaken Sydney's most untouchable billionaire in front of the entire elite class. But for the first time in years, Ethan did not care about headlines. He cared about the small girl sleeping quietly on the sofa, while Clara gently brushed blonde hair away from her daughter's face with the tenderness of someone who had spent years turning exhaustion into love. Ethan could not stop watching her hands. The same hands that used to hold coffee mugs against cold mornings in their old apartment. The same hands that once fixed his tie before interviews because she said powerful men always forgot small details when they were nervous. He remembered laughing at that. Clara had kissed his cheek afterward and told him, "You only look confident because people do not see your hands shaking." Back then, she was the only person who ever noticed when he was afraid. Ethan swallowed hard and looked away toward the harbor again. "Noah," Clara said softly, "come sit down for a moment." The little boy obeyed immediately, climbing onto the armchair across from Ethan. His movements were calm, thoughtful. Ethan recognized that too. Noah studied people before speaking, exactly the way Ethan had learned to do in boardrooms filled with dangerous men pretending to smile. The realization unsettled him deeply. Clara glanced at the antique clock on the wall. "It is getting late." Ethan turned toward her quickly. "Stay a little longer." The words came out too fast, too honest. Clara paused. "Ethan, I know I do not deserve explanations," he said quietly, "but I need to understand what happened." Clara lowered her eyes briefly. For a moment, she looked older than 33. Not physically, emotionally, like life had placed too many winters inside her chest too early. "You already know what happened," she answered softly. "The world accused me, and you believed them. I did not fully believe it." No, a sad smile touched her lips. "You just chose not to defend me. That hurt because it was true." Ethan loosened his tie completely now, suddenly feeling suffocated by his own expensive clothes. "Clara, I was under pressure from the board. Every investor was threatening to walk away. The company was collapsing. And I was pregnant." Silence crashed through the room instantly. Ethan stopped breathing for half a second. Clara's eyes finally met his. There was no accusation inside them anymore. Only exhaustion. "I found out 3 days before the tabloids released those photographs." Ethan stared at her, unable to move. His mind immediately dragged him backward through time, whether he wanted it or not. 6 years earlier. Endless camera flashes outside Callaway Holdings headquarters. Reporters shouting questions. Investors demanding emergency meetings. Clara crying quietly in their apartment kitchen while newspapers covered the marble counter like weapons. "Tell me you believe me," she had whispered that night. Ethan remembered the exact way she looked standing barefoot beneath the apartment lights wearing one of his oversized jumpers. Beautiful, frightened, alone. And instead of holding her, he had answered with business language. Damage control, media strategy, temporary separation from public appearances. God, even now the memory made him sick. Why did you not tell me about the babies? Ethan asked carefully, though his voice sounded weaker now. Clara laughed softly under her breath, but there was no humor in it. I tried. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Clara leaned back slightly, while Lily continued sleeping peacefully beside her. 2 weeks after I left Sydney, I came to your office. Ethan's heartbeat slowed painfully. I never saw you. I know. Her eyes drifted toward the harbor lights again. Your security team refused to let me upstairs. Ethan's stomach tightened immediately. That is impossible. It is not. Clara spoke gently, almost too gently. One of your board members came downstairs instead. Ethan already knew the name before she said it. Richard Holloway, senior partner, old family friend. The man who spent years teaching Ethan that emotions made powerful men vulnerable. Clara folded her hands together quietly in her lap. Richard told me you were in meetings and did not wish to see me. Ethan's jaw tightened instantly. He said that. He also said your legal team would contact me if necessary. Noah looked between them silently, sensing the heaviness in the room even if he could not fully understand it. Ethan pressed one hand against the back of a leather chair, trying to steady the sudden anger rising through him. Richard had told him Clara disappeared willingly after the scandal exploded. Said she refused communication. Said she wanted money and privacy. Ethan believed him because believing him was easier than admitting the woman he loved had been abandoned while terrified and pregnant. I waited downstairs for nearly 2 hours, Clara continued softly. It started raining eventually. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Sydney rain. Cold wind near the harbor. Clara alone outside his office building carrying twins she had not even begun showing yet, while he sat upstairs discussing quarterly losses with men who measured humanity through spreadsheets. The image made something inside him crack quietly. Why did you never try again? He asked. Clara looked at him with calm sadness. Because you never came after me. The truth settled heavily into every corner of the room. Ethan remembered that period clearly now. He had buried himself inside work after Clara vanished. New acquisitions, international expansion, interviews, awards, entire years spent building an empire large enough to distract himself from the empty side of his bed. Everyone called him successful. Nobody realized he was simply running from grief. Noah suddenly looked toward Ethan again. Mom kept one photo of you. Clara inhaled softly. Noah, it is true. The little boy continued innocently. She keeps it in the blue box under her bed. Ethan looked slowly toward Clara, whose cheeks had turned faintly pink for the first time all evening. You kept a photograph? Clara gave a small shrug, embarrassed by her own honesty now. The children asked questions when they got older. So you told them about me? Her eyes softened slightly as she looked toward Noah and Lily. I told them their father was intelligent and stubborn, and that he once made pancakes so badly the smoke alarm nearly exploded. Ethan laughed quietly before emotion caught in his throat halfway through the sound. Because suddenly he understood something almost unbearable. Clara had every reason to hate him, every reason to poison the children against him. But she had not. Instead, she protected the memory of him for 6 years while raising his children alone. And somehow that kindness felt heavier than punishment ever could. Some truths do not break a man immediately. They sit quietly inside his chest first, expanding slowly until there is no room left for pride. Ethan stood near the lounge window long after Clara stopped speaking, watching the reflection of Sydney Harbor ripple faintly across the glass, while his mind replayed every detail she had revealed. She had come to him, pregnant, alone, terrified, and he had never known because the people he trusted most decided protecting his company mattered more than protecting the woman carrying his children. The realization poisoned everything he thought he understood about the past. Noah had climbed onto the sofa beside Lily now, carefully covering his sister with a folded blanket Clara found resting over the armchair. The small gesture made Ethan's throat tighten unexpectedly. You always do that, Clara whispered softly to Noah. Do what? Take care of everyone first. Noah shrugged. You get tired. Ethan looked away immediately after hearing that. 6 years old, and already old enough to notice exhaustion in his mother's eyes. Clara gently brushed her fingers through Noah's hair before finally standing. We should leave before the children fall asleep completely. Panic moved through Ethan faster than he expected. Wait. Clara paused near the sofa. Ethan struggled briefly for words, something that almost never happened to him anymore. In boardrooms, language obeyed him easily. Investors listened when he spoke. Journalists quoted him. Employees feared disappointing him. But standing here now, he felt strangely helpless. Because money could solve business problems. It could not repair 6 years of absence. Please stay tonight, he said quietly. Clara stared at him in disbelief. Ethan, I do not mean here. He ran one hand through his hair slowly. I have drivers. Security. Whatever you need. It is late. Clara's expression softened slightly, though sadness still lingered beneath it. We took the train. Ethan blinked once. From where? Newcastle. The answer landed heavily. Nearly 160 kilometers. Clara had traveled all the way from Newcastle with 2 children just because he invited her to a gala designed to humiliate her. Shame crawled through him again. You came that far? Clara gave a faint shrug. The twins wanted to see Sydney. Noah immediately brightened. The opera house was smaller than television. Ethan laughed quietly before stopping himself. The sound felt unfamiliar after years of carefully controlled public appearances. Real laughter had become rare in his life. Most things are, he admitted. Clara glanced at him carefully after hearing the warmth in his voice. For a brief second, Ethan saw confusion in her eyes. Perhaps because she remembered the old version of him too. The man before wealth hardened into distance. Before ambition replaced softness. Before silence ruined everything. A soft knock interrupted the room. Ethan opened the door to find one of his assistants standing nervously outside, holding a tablet. Mr. Calloway, the board is requesting you downstairs immediately. Ethan's expression darkened instantly. Tell them I am occupied. The assistant hesitated. Sir, it is regarding the press. I said I am occupied. She nodded quickly before disappearing again. Clara folded her arms lightly. You should go. I do not care about the board right now. You should. Her voice remained calm. That company still matters to thousands of employees. Ethan stared at her quietly. Even now, after everything, Clara still thought about other people before herself. That was always her problem. And perhaps the reason he never truly recovered after losing her. You defended me once, Ethan said suddenly. Clara frowned slightly. What? 5 years ago, during the manufacturing layoffs. She looked surprised he remembered. The newspapers blamed you for outsourcing jobs overseas. Ethan continued softly. Everyone wanted a statement from you. But you told the media it was my decision, not the employee's fault. Clara looked down briefly. People needed jobs. You protected my reputation after I destroyed yours. Silence settled gently between them again. Ethan slowly realized something painful. Clara had spent years carrying his mistakes, with more grace than he deserved. The twins began growing visibly sleepier now. Lily rubbed one eye while leaning against Clara's side, and Noah struggled unsuccessfully to hide a yawn. Ethan checked the time. Nearly 10:30. I will have my driver take you home, he said firmly. Clara shook her head immediately. That is not necessary. Clara. His tone softened carefully. Please stop treating kindness like debt. The word surprised her. Ethan could see it instantly. Perhaps because the old version of him often treated generosity like a transaction. Gifts instead of emotional presence. Expensive holidays instead of time. But somewhere between seeing his son stare at fairies through glass windows and hearing his daughter confess Clara still cried over him, something inside Ethan had shifted quietly. Clara studied him for several seconds before finally nodding once. All right. Relief moved through him unexpectedly. Such a small agreement should not have mattered this much. But it did. Because for the first time tonight, Clara had accepted something from him willingly instead of out of obligation. Noah climbed down from the sofa while Ethan grabbed his suit jacket from the chair nearby. Can I ask one question? The little boy said carefully. Ethan looked at him immediately. Of course. Noah hesitated. Why were you not there before? The room became very still. Clara inhaled softly beside him, but Ethan lifted one hand slightly to stop her from answering for him. Because the child deserved honesty, even if it embarrassed him. Ethan crouched slowly until he was eye level with Noah. Because sometimes adults make mistakes they do not understand until it is too late. Noah considered that answer seriously. Like when I accidentally broke Mom's toaster? Ethan smiled faintly. Much worse than the toaster. Noah nodded thoughtfully, as if measuring the weight of grown-up mistakes against household appliances. Then he asked the question Ethan feared most. Are you going to disappear again? Ethan felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. Across the room, Clara looked away toward the harbor lights, almost as though she could not bear hearing the answer. Herself. Ethan stared at Noah carefully before speaking. Not if your mother lets me stay. The little boy accepted that answer more easily than Ethan expected. Children did not measure love through complicated history. They measured it through presence. Through who stayed. Noah simply nodded once before taking Lily's hand gently. Ethan stood slowly again, and for the first time in years, the billionaire who controlled one of Australia's most powerful companies realized something humbling. The most important negotiation of his life was no longer happening inside boardrooms filled with investors. It was happening quietly inside a lounge overlooking Sydney Harbor, beside a woman he failed once already and two children who did not yet know whether they could trust him. The hardest part about earning forgiveness was realizing you were not entitled to it. Ethan rode the private elevator down toward the underground parking garage, while Clara stood quietly beside the twins, her arms wrapped gently around Lily, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder. Noah leaned against the polished elevator wall, fighting exhaustion with determined little blinks. The golden lights above reflected softly against the steel interior, but nobody spoke for several seconds. Ethan could still feel the weight of Noah's question pressing inside his chest. Are you going to disappear again? Children always asked the simplest questions with the sharpest honesty. When the elevator doors finally opened, cool night air drifted through the concrete garage beneath the hotel. Luxury vehicles lined the polished floor beneath soft white lighting, while security guards nodded respectfully the moment they recognized Ethan. He barely noticed them. The car is this way, he said quietly. Clara followed him slowly while Noah walked beside Ethan instead of behind him now. Such a small thing should not have mattered. But it did. Trust from children arrived in inches, not miles. Ethan led them toward a black Mercedes parked near the private exit. The driver immediately stepped out and opened the rear door. Good evening, Mr. Calloway. Ethan nodded once. We are heading to Newcastle. The driver blinked, slightly in surprise before recovering quickly. Of course, sir. Clara frowned immediately. Ethan, that is not necessary. The children and I can manage. It is 2 hours at night. We have done it before. The quiet honesty in her voice made him pause. Of course they had. Clara had probably carried sleeping children through train stations more times than he could imagine. She had survived 6 years without asking anyone for rescue. Ethan lowered his voice carefully. You should not have had to. Clara looked away after that, and he realized some apologies were too late to sound comforting. Noah climbed into the car first while Ethan carefully helped Clara settle Lily onto the back seat without waking her. The little girl curled instinctively against her mother, even in sleep. Ethan watched the movement quietly. Children trusted the person who stayed beside them during storms. That role had belonged entirely to Clara for 6 years. The realization humbled him more than any business failure ever had. Once everyone settled inside, the car pulled smoothly out of the underground garage and into the glowing Sydney night. Rain had begun falling lightly over the city, turning traffic lights into blurred reflections across wet streets. Ethan sat across from Clara in the spacious rear cabin, while Noah stared excitedly out the windows. Everything looks shiny, the boy whispered. Clara smiled faintly. That is what rain does to cities. Ethan watched her face carefully under the soft interior lighting. She still looked beautiful. Not the polished magazine cover beauty she carried in her 20s when photographers followed her through Bondi beaches and fashion events. This beauty was quieter now, softer, built from survival instead of attention. The kind of beauty people only noticed when they truly looked. Mom used to be famous, Noah announced suddenly. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Noah. What? You do not need to tell everyone everything. Noah frowned. But he already knows you. Ethan smiled faintly. I remember. Noah turned toward him immediately. Did you see her on billboards too? Ethan looked at Clara for a moment before answering. Yes. Noah grinned. Proudly. She is prettier in real life. Clara covered her face briefly with one hand in embarrassment, while Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. The sound surprised all of them slightly. It even surprised him, because he could not remember the last time a conversation felt this natural. His life lately consisted mostly of negotiations, interviews, quarterly reports, and expensive dinners where nobody said what they actually meant. But this felt painfully human again. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the city slowly disappeared behind them. Once they reached the motorway north, traffic thinned into scattered headlights stretching through darkness. Noah eventually curled against Clara's side, exhausted at last. Within minutes, both twins were asleep beside her. Ethan watched quietly as Clara adjusted their blankets with practiced care. "You are good with them," he said softly. Clara looked down at the sleeping twins. "I had to become good quickly." Guilt moved through him again. "You should not have done it alone." Clara stayed silent for several seconds before finally answering. "At first, I hated you for that." Ethan accepted the words without defending himself. He deserved them. Then what changed? Clara leaned her head lightly against the seat behind her while rain continued sliding across the glass beside them. "One night Noah had a fever when he was 3. I had not slept properly in days. Lily was crying because she thought her brother was dying." Her voice remained calm, but Ethan could hear the exhaustion inside the memory itself. "I remember sitting on the kitchen floor at 4 in the morning thinking I could not do it anymore." Ethan stared at her quietly. "But then Noah woke up and asked if I was okay because I looked sad." A small smile touched her lips. "That was the moment I stopped hating you." Ethan frowned slightly, confused. Clara looked toward the sleeping boy beside her. "Because I realized the children deserved better than bitterness." Silence filled the car again after that. Ethan turned toward the dark motorway outside while her words settled heavily inside him. Clara had transformed pain into kindness while he transformed pain into ambition. Perhaps that was the difference between them all along. She healed by loving harder. He healed by building walls. His phone vibrated suddenly against the leather seat beside him. Richard Holloway. Ethan's expression darkened immediately. Clara noticed. "You should answer." Ethan declined the call without hesitation. Seconds later, another message appeared across the screen. "We need to discuss tonight immediately. The press is already asking questions." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment before locking the phone entirely and setting it aside. Clara watched him carefully. "That is unlike you." "What is?" "Ignoring business problems." Ethan looked at the sleeping twins before answering quietly. "Maybe I finally realized which problems matter more." Clara's expression shifted slightly after hearing that. Not trust yet, but something gentler than distance. The rain outside grew heavier as the motorway stretched through darkness toward Newcastle. Inside the quiet warmth of the car, Ethan watched Clara slowly begin falling asleep beside the children she protected alone for 6 years. Her head tilted softly against the seat while exhaustion finally claimed her. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Calloway felt something unfamiliar replacing the emptiness that usually followed him home at night. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter. Like hope arriving carefully after being unwelcome for a very long time. Rain still covered the motorway when the car finally entered Newcastle just after midnight. But the city felt quieter than Sydney in a way Ethan immediately noticed. Fewer lights. Smaller buildings. Less noise pretending to be importance. The driver followed Clara's directions through narrow residential streets lined with modest brick homes and sleeping jacaranda trees dripping rainwater beneath yellow street lamps. Ethan stared out the window silently while exhaustion settled over the sleeping twins in the back seat. Clara had fallen asleep too sometime during the drive, her head tilted lightly against the glass beside Lily. Strands of blonde hair rested across her cheek while one hand remained instinctively draped protectively over both children, even in sleep. Ethan looked away after a moment because something about the sight hurt him unexpectedly. She trusted herself to carry everything alone now. The car finally slowed in front of a small weatherboard duplex near the edge of a quiet street. The porch light glowed softly against the rain while flower pots sat carefully arranged beside the steps despite the late season. It was not glamorous, not luxurious, but it felt lived in. Warm. Real. Clara blinked awake slowly when the car stopped. For a second, she looked disoriented before memory returned to her expression. "We are here," she whispered softly. Ethan glanced toward the house again. "This is where you live." Clara nodded. "For 3 years now." Noah was already half awake beside her, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Can I carry Lily?" he mumbled. Clara smiled faintly. You are too tired to carry yourself. Before she could move, Ethan stepped out into the rain and opened the rear door carefully. Cool night air drifted into the warm cabin. I will get her. Clara hesitated instinctively, like someone in used to help. Then finally she nodded once. Ethan carefully lifted Lily into his arms, surprised by how light she felt. The little girl stirred briefly against his chest before settling again, trusting him automatically in the careless way children sometimes trusted before adults gave them reasons not to. Ethan swallowed hard as he followed Clara toward the porch through light rain. Noah held tightly onto Clara's hand while the driver quietly unloaded a small overnight bag from the boot. Clara unlocked the front door softly. Warm lamplight spilled across the entryway the moment they stepped inside. Ethan stopped moving for a second without meaning to. The house smelled faintly of vanilla candles and laundry detergent. Children's drawings covered one wall beside the kitchen entrance. Tiny shoes rested near the door. A stack of picture books leaned crookedly beside a worn beige couch beneath knitted blankets. Nothing inside the home matched the expensive perfection Ethan surrounded himself with in Sydney. Yet somehow this place felt more peaceful than his multi-million-dollar penthouse ever had. You can put her on the sofa for a moment, Clara whispered. Ethan gently laid Lily against the cushions while Clara helped Noah remove his shoes. The little boy yawned dramatically. Can I still have cereal? Clara laughed quietly. At midnight. Noah nodded hopefully. Ethan smiled before he could stop himself. Clara noticed immediately. You always smiled more around children. Ethan looked at her carefully. I was supposed to have my own. The sadness in his voice settled heavily between them. Clara looked away first. Noah disappeared briefly down the hallway before returning carrying a faded stuffed dinosaur beneath one arm. Mr. Waffles says good night, he announced seriously to Ethan. Ethan blinked once before nodding respectfully toward the toy. Good night, Mr. Waffles. Noah seemed satisfied by the response. Clara shook her head softly while trying not to smile. You did not have to encourage him. I think your dinosaur and I have a strong professional relationship already. Noah grinned proudly before wandering sleepily toward the hallway again. Clara touched his shoulder gently. Brush your teeth first. I know, he sighed dramatically. Ethan watched the interaction quietly while rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows nearby. Everything inside this home carried traces of Clara's life without him. Tiny lunchboxes drying beside the sink. School notices attached to the refrigerator with magnets. A cracked ceramic mug with faded letters spelling world's best mom. 6 years of memories built without Ethan even knowing they existed. Clara noticed him staring at the refrigerator. Lily made that mug at school. Ethan nodded slowly. She spelled mum correctly. Clara laughed softly. That took several attempts. God, the sound nearly destroyed him. He had forgotten what her real laugh sounded like without cameras nearby. Softer than he remembered. Warmer. Ethan removed his suit jacket slowly, suddenly aware of how ridiculous he looked standing inside this small home dressed for a billionaire gala while children's cartoons played quietly from another room. Clara noticed too. You look very out of place. Here. Ethan glanced around the modest kitchen. Maybe that is because I have spent too much time in the wrong places. The honesty surprised her. He could see it immediately in her expression. Ethan himself barely recognized the man speaking tonight. Somewhere along the years, he had learned to bury sincerity beneath confidence because powerful men were rewarded for certainty, not vulnerability. But this house made pretending feel impossible. Clara poured a glass of water quietly before offering him one too. Thank you, he said softly. She leaned against the kitchen counter afterward while studying him carefully beneath the warm light overhead. You really do not remember becoming this serious, do you? Ethan frowned slightly. What do you mean? Before everything happened, you used to laugh constantly. Her eyes softened faintly with memory. You once spent 40 minutes trying to build a bookshelf because you refused to read the instructions. Ethan actually laughed quietly at that. The shelf collapsed. Twice. For one dangerous moment, it almost felt like the past again. Like they were simply two exhausted people standing inside a small home after midnight, discussing ordinary memories instead of 6 years of heartbreak. Then Ethan noticed the framed photograph near the hallway entrance. Clara at the beach with the twins several summers ago. Noah sitting on her shoulders while Lily hugged her waist. All three smiling beneath bright sunlight. Happy. Ethan stared at the picture for several silent seconds. They look loved, he whispered finally. Clara's expression changed softly after hearing that. They are. Ethan nodded once while emotion tightened painfully inside his chest. Because suddenly he understood something devastatingly clear. Clara Whitmore had built a beautiful life from the ruins he left behind. And now the question haunting him was no longer whether the twins could become part of his world. It was whether he deserved to become part of theirs. The difference between a house and a home was never money. It was whether someone waited for you inside. Ethan stood alone in Clara's small kitchen while the hallway light glowed softly in the distance. And the quiet sounds of bedtime drifted faintly through the house. A tap running. Noah complaining sleepily about brushing his teeth. Clara laughing under her breath while reminding Lily to stop hiding her pajamas. The ordinary sounds wrapped around Ethan in a way luxury never had. In Sydney, silence filled his penthouse like expensive furniture nobody touched. Here, even exhaustion sounded warm. He loosened the last button of his shirt slowly while staring at the refrigerator again. School drawings covered nearly every surface. Crayon stick figures holding hands beneath oversized yellow suns. One drawing showed Clara standing beside two tiny blonde children and a tall man with dark hair. Ethan moved closer before realizing something that made his chest tighten painfully. The fourth figure was labeled Dad. He swallowed hard. The children had imagined him into their lives long before tonight. Clara walked back into the kitchen quietly after settling the twins into bed. She wore a pale knitted jumper now, with loose gray lounge pants. Her blonde hair tied back carelessly. Somehow she looked even more beautiful without the glamour of the gala. More real. Ethan noticed faint exhaustion beneath her eyes again and hated himself for recognizing it too late. They usually fall asleep faster, she said softly. They were excited tonight. Ethan nodded once. I understand. Silence settled between them again, though not uncomfortable this time. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while warm yellow light filled the kitchen. Clara reached automatically for the kettle before pausing. Tea. Ethan almost smiled. You still ask that even after everything. You still drink it terribly, she replied quietly. Too much sugar. Ethan laughed softly under his breath. That is because your tea tastes like boiled sadness. Clara covered a smile briefly with her hand before turning toward the counter again. Watching her move around the kitchen awakened memories Ethan had spent years trying to bury beneath work. Sunday mornings. Shared grocery lists. Late-night conversations beside open windows while Sydney traffic glowed below their apartment. He suddenly realized something cruel about grief. It did not erase beautiful memories. It sharpened them until they hurt. Clara handed him a chipped ceramic mug decorated with tiny painted lemons. Ethan looked down at it carefully. This does not seem like your style. Lily picked it at a charity market. Clara leaned lightly against the opposite counter afterward while steam rose softly between them. She said it looked cheerful. Ethan glanced again toward the hallway leading to the twins' bedrooms. She seems gentle. Clara's expression softened immediately. Lily feels everything deeply. And Noah? Clara smiled faintly. Noah pretends he is brave even when he is frightened. Ethan looked down at his tea for a moment. That sounds familiar. Clara studied him quietly after hearing that. You used to do the same thing. The honesty in her voice unsettled him because she was right. Ethan had spent most of his life disguising fear as control. Even the cruel message he sent Clara before the gala now felt embarrassingly transparent. He had wanted power over the situation because deep down he feared she no longer cared about him at all. Why did you come tonight? He asked suddenly. Clara looked surprised by the question. You invited me. That is not an answer. She stayed quiet for several seconds while rain whispered against the roof above them. Part of me wanted closure. Ethan's chest tightened. And the other part? Clara looked directly at him now. The other part wanted to see whether the man I loved still existed somewhere inside the person you became. The words landed gently, but they hurt more than anger could have. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. I am not sure anymore. Clara's expression softened with sadness. That scares me because 6 years ago, you were kind before you were powerful. Ethan stared at the tea in his hands while guilt spread slowly through him again. Somewhere along the way, success had convinced him that protecting his empire mattered more than protecting people. And now he stood inside a modest kitchen, realizing the woman he lost had somehow preserved more humanity in a small duplex than he had inside billion-dollar offices. His phone buzzed. Suddenly across the counter again. Richard Holloway. Ethan stared at the screen until it stopped ringing. Seconds later, another message appeared. The board meeting has been moved to 8 tomorrow morning. You need to control this situation immediately. Clara noticed the tension in his expression. They are worried about the scandal. Ethan gave a humorless laugh. The board fears anything they cannot manage financially. Clara looked down into her tea quietly. The press destroyed me once already. I do not want the children involved. Ethan immediately set his mug down. That will not happen. You cannot promise that. Yes, he said firmly. I can. Something in his voice made Clara look at him carefully. Ethan stepped closer slowly, emotion tightening his chest again. I failed you once because I let other people decide what mattered more than you did. His voice lowered. I will not make that mistake with the twins. Clara stared at him silently while rain continued outside. For a moment, Ethan thought she might step away. Instead, she asked the question quietly. Why now? Ethan struggled briefly for words before answering honestly. Because tonight I saw my son asking whether I was going to disappear again. His jaw tightened slightly. And I realized I already missed 6 years I cannot get back. Clara looked away first. Emotion moved behind her eyes before she hid it carefully again. Ethan remembered that expression. Clara always protected her tears like they embarrassed her. You know what hurts the most? She whispered finally. For years I kept imagining what kind of father you would have been. Ethan felt his throat tighten painfully. Clara laughed softly under her breath, though sadness filled the sound. Noah loves building things. Lily sings while she colors. Every time they did something beautiful, I wondered if you would have smiled the way I did. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. The grief inside those words nearly broke him. Because Clara had not only lost a partner 6 years ago, she lost the future she imagined for her children too. Ethan looked around the small kitchen again. The magnets, the school drawings, the half-finished grocery list. Beside the fridge, evidence of a life Clara carried alone while he spent years chasing recognition from strangers who would replace him the moment his company lost value. Suddenly none of it felt impressive anymore. Not the penthouse, not the awards, not the private jet waiting in Sydney. Because standing here now, Ethan finally understood the terrible cost of building a successful life while neglecting the people who were supposed to share it with you. Regret was a quiet thing. It did not scream. It sat beside you at 2 in the morning while rain touched the windows and reminded you how many moments you could never relive. Ethan remained in Clara's kitchen long after their tea had gone cold. The house had grown quieter now. No sleepy footsteps. No whispered bedtime negotiations from the hallway. Only the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain moving across the roof. Clara stood at the sink rinsing the mugs carefully while Ethan watched her in silence. 6 years ago, he would have offered to help automatically. Back then, love still lived inside small gestures between them. Now he hesitated because he no longer knew what he was allowed to touch in her life. Clara dried her hands slowly before turning toward him again. You should probably head back to Sydney before the weather gets worse. Ethan glanced toward the dark windows. It is nearly 1 in the morning. You have a board meeting at 8. I do not care about the board meeting. Clara sighed softly. That is exactly why you should leave. Tonight has already changed too much. Ethan leaned lightly against the kitchen counter, exhaustion finally beginning to settle into his face. Do you know what the strangest part is? Clara looked at him quietly, but said nothing. I spent years believing you abandoned me. His voice lowered slightly. And now I walk into this house and realize you spent 6 years protecting my memory for children I never even knew existed. Clara crossed her arms gently. I protected their innocence, Ethan. There is a difference. You still could have hated me. I tried. A sad smile touched her lips briefly. But children become curious eventually. They ask where their eyes came from, why their hair is darker than mine, why other kids have fathers at school events. Ethan lowered his eyes. Clara continued softly. I never wanted Noah and Lily growing up believing they were unwanted. The words hit him hard because that was exactly what he feared they would think now. Ethan looked toward the hallway instinctively. Do they know the truth? Clara shook her head slowly. Not fully. What did you tell them? She hesitated briefly before answering. I told them their father and I loved each other once, but life became complicated. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath, though sadness filled the sound. That is a very generous version of reality. Clara's expression softened faintly. Children deserve softer truths when they are small. Ethan stared at her carefully after hearing that. God. She still moved through life protecting everyone around her from pain, even when nobody protected her from it. His phone vibrated again across the counter. This time it was Sebastian. Ethan answered quietly before Clara could insist otherwise. What? Sebastian sounded exhausted already. Please tell me you are not reading the news. Ethan's jaw tightened instantly. What happened? Photographs from the gala leaked an hour ago. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Of course they had. Wealthy people treated privacy like entertainment whenever someone else was suffering. How bad? Every media outlet in the country is running the same story. Sebastian exhaled heavily. Mysterious twins shock billionaire CEO at foundation gala. Clara looked down immediately after hearing that. Ethan's expression hardened. Are the children visible? Some photographs, yes. Ethan straightened instantly. Have legal remove every image involving the twins. Already trying. Sebastian lowered his voice slightly. But Richard is furious. The board thinks your silence confirms the children are yours. Ethan almost laughed at the stupidity of that sentence. Because they are mine. Silence met him on the other end of the call. Even Sebastian sounded stunned hearing the words spoken aloud directly for the first time. You are certain? Ethan looked toward the hallway again. I have never been more certain about anything. Clara quietly turned away while emotion flickered across her face. Sebastian finally spoke again. Richard called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. Ethan's expression darkened immediately. Good. Good. Because I am done letting Richard decide things for me. He ended the call before Sebastian could respond further. The kitchen became silent again except for rain against glass. Clara folded her arms tighter across herself. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Ethan stepped closer carefully. I will fix it. You cannot fix 6 years with a press statement. No, he admitted quietly. But I can stop strangers from turning our children into headlines. The word "are" hung softly between them. Clara looked up slowly after hearing it. Ethan realized then that this was the first time he had spoken about Noah and Lily as belonging to both of them instead of only her. Something fragile shifted behind Clara's eyes before she hid it carefully again. They are sleeping, she whispered. Please keep your voice down. Ethan nodded immediately. Old instincts returned without thinking. Respecting the children. Protecting the calm inside the house. Strange how naturally it came to him despite missing 6 years. Clara walked toward the living room afterward, and Ethan followed quietly. The small lamp near the sofa cast warm golden light across the space, while rainwater slid down the windows outside. Clara stopped near the hallway entrance. There is something else you should know. Ethan looked at her carefully. What? She hesitated briefly, almost as though debating whether honesty was worth reopening old wounds. Richard Holloway was not the only reason I left. Ethan frowned slightly. What do you mean? Clara wrapped her arms around herself. 3 weeks after I found out I was pregnant, someone offered me money. Ethan felt immediate coldness move through his chest. Who? Clara looked directly at him now. Your mother. Silence crashed through the room instantly. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. No. She came to my apartment personally. Clara's voice remained calm, but he could hear old pain beneath it now. She said your future was too important to be tied to scandal. Ethan shook his head immediately. My mother would never. But even as the words left his mouth, uncertainty followed them. Because deep down, he knew exactly how obsessed Victoria Calloway was with reputation. Clara continued softly. She told me loving you meant leaving before I destroyed your career permanently. Ethan looked away sharply while shock settled through him. Suddenly, old conversations returned with brutal clarity. His mother insisting Clara was too emotional for public life. Too unpredictable. Too working class despite her modeling career. God, how had he never seen it clearly before? Clara's eyes lowered toward the floor. I was 27, pregnant, humiliated publicly, and abandoned by the only man I trusted. Her voice cracked softly for the first time all night. I did not have enough strength left to fight your family too. Ethan felt something inside him break, quietly hearing that. Because standing inside this small house now, he finally understood the full truth. Clara had not simply left him 6 years ago. She had been pushed out of his world piece by people who valued his empire more than his happiness. And the cruelest part was that he had helped them do it. The most dangerous lies were the ones built from silence, because silence gave everyone permission to invent their own truth. Ethan stood motionless in Clara's living room while rain moved steadily across the windows behind him, and the weight of her confession settled heavily through his chest. His mother knew. Richard knew. People around him had known pieces of the truth for years while he spent 6 years believing Clara abandoned him willingly. Suddenly, every memory from that time looked different. Every conversation, every warning, every carefully planted doubt. Clara wrapped her arms around herself quietly, as though speaking about the past had physically exhausted her. "You do not have to say anything," she whispered. Ethan finally looked at her again. "My mother offered you money to disappear." Clara nodded once. She called it protection. Ethan laughed softly under his breath. But there was no humor in the sound. "That sounds exactly like her." The admission surprised Clara slightly. Ethan rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw while anger moved quietly beneath his skin. Not explosive anger. Worse, the controlled kind that arrived when betrayal became impossible to ignore anymore. "How much?" he asked finally. Clara looked embarrassed suddenly. "It does not matter." "How much, Clara?" She hesitated before answering softly. $500,000. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. $500,000 to erase the woman he loved from his life before she could become inconvenient to his public image. The cruelty of it made him sick. "I never accepted it," Clara added quietly. Ethan looked at her sharply. "What?" "Your mother left the check on my kitchen table." Clara lowered her eyes briefly. "I tore it apart after she left." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment because somehow that hurt even more. Clara had been pregnant, publicly humiliated, emotionally abandoned, and still refused money because somewhere inside her she still believed love should not be negotiated financially. God, he did not deserve her. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked carefully. Clara leaned against the arm of the sofa as exhaustion settled visibly across her face. "Because tonight was supposed to humiliate me." Ethan immediately looked away in shame. "Clara." No, her voice stayed soft, but firm. "You deserve to hear it." Rain continued whispering outside, while warm light filled the small room around them. "When your message arrived yesterday, part of me thought maybe 6 years had changed you." She swallowed quietly. "Then I read your words again and realized you still wanted me to feel small." Ethan felt every sentence land like punishment because she was right. The cruel text message. The public invitation. The ballroom full of wealthy strangers waiting to watch Clara fail. He had convinced himself it was harmless revenge for old wounds. Now he saw it clearly for what it really was. Cowardice disguised as confidence. "I hated you when I sent that message," he admitted quietly. Clara looked at him carefully. "No, you hated yourself. I was. Simply easier to punish." Silence filled the room after that because Ethan knew she was right again. He had spent years angry at Clara because blaming her protected him from facing his own guilt. If she abandoned him willingly, then he could remain the victim in his own story. But now the truth stood painfully clear between them. Clara never betrayed him. She simply survived him. Ethan sat slowly on the edge of the sofa while exhaustion finally reached his face completely. The billionaire everyone feared suddenly looked less like a powerful CEO and more like a man discovering his life had been built on manipulated memories. "Did my mother ever contact you again?" Clara shook her head. "Not directly." Ethan frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Clara hesitated before answering. "Every time a modeling agency considered hiring me after the scandal, somehow the opportunity disappeared." Ethan's stomach tightened instantly. "You think she interfered?" Clara gave a faint shrug. "I stopped asking questions eventually." Ethan looked toward the dark windows while anger spread colder now. His entire world suddenly felt contaminated by manipulation. Richard controlling access to him. His mother deciding Clara was unsuitable for the Callaway name. Board members treating love like a threat to company stability. And through all of it, Clara stood alone carrying twins while he remained blind inside conference rooms discussing profits. "I should have come after you," he whispered finally. Clara's eyes softened sadly. "Yes. You should have." The honesty hurt because it carried no cruelty, just truth. Ethan ran both hands slowly over his face before looking toward the hallway where Noah and Lily slept peacefully. "Do they know my surname?" Clara nodded once. Noah asked why his name was different from yours after seeing an article about you online last year. Ethan's chest tightened. What did you tell him? Clara smiled faintly with sadness. I told him some people belong to each other even when the world makes it complicated. Ethan stared at her silently. She still spoke about him gently to the children despite every reason not to. That kind of grace felt almost unbearable. Now, his phone buzzed once more against the coffee table. This time Ethan did not even look immediately. But Clara noticed the name glowing across the screen before it faded dark again. Victoria Calloway. Ethan stared at the silent phone for several seconds. She knows, Clara whispered softly. The media probably called her already. Ethan picked up the phone slowly before standing. I should answer. Clara nodded quietly, though tension immediately returned to her expression. Ethan walked toward the kitchen before accepting the call. His mother's voice arrived instantly, sharp and controlled even at nearly 2 in the morning. Tell me the rumors are false. Ethan stared out the dark kitchen window while rain moved softly across the glass. They are not rumors. Silence answered him briefly. Then Victoria inhaled slowly. Ethan, whatever this situation is, we need to handle it carefully before the markets open. Something inside him snapped quietly hearing that. Not sadness. Clarity. Even now, after learning she hid his children from him for 6 years, his mother's first concern remained public perception. Did you offer Clara money to leave? Silence again. Longer this time. I did what was necessary to protect your future. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. You had no right. I had every right, Victoria replied sharply. You were emotional, reckless, distracted. That woman was destroying your reputation. Ethan looked toward the hallway where his children slept peacefully for the first time, knowing their father stood only meters away. She was carrying your grandchildren. The silence after that felt different. Not guilt. Shock. Because somehow Victoria Calloway had spent years manipulating lives without ever considering the human cost beyond her son's reputation. Ethan lowered his voice carefully, afraid of waking the twins. You stole 6 years from me. Ethan, no, his tone hardened quietly. You do not get to speak now. Not tonight. He ended the call before she could answer. The kitchen became silent again except for rain against the roof. Ethan stood there breathing slowly while emotion moved heavily through him. Then he looked back toward Clara. Standing quietly in the living room beneath the warm light of the small home she built without him. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Calloway understood something his wealth had protected him from learning too early. Sometimes the people closest to you could destroy your happiness while genuinely believing they were helping you. By 3 in the morning, the rain had finally stopped, but Ethan still could not sleep. Clara had offered him the couch despite his protests. And now he sat alone in the dim living room while moonlight filtered softly through the windows of the small Newcastle duplex. The house felt completely different at night. Quieter, more fragile somehow. He could hear the ticking kitchen clock, the soft hum of the heater. Somewhere down the hallway, Lily murmured something in her sleep before silence returned again. Ethan leaned forward with his elbows resting against his knees while exhaustion carved shadows beneath his eyes. His tailored shirt was wrinkled now. His expensive watch sat forgotten on the coffee table beside untouched tea. For the first time in years, Ethan Calloway did not look like one of Australia's most powerful men. He looked like someone grieving a life he should have had. His phone screen glowed again with missed calls. Board members, investors, public relations advisors. His mother, Richard Holloway. None of them mattered right now. Ethan stared instead at the family photographs lining the shelf beside the television. Clara at Noah's first day of school. Lily holding a crooked birthday cake with missing icing along one side. The twins at the beach wrapped inside towels while Clara laughed behind the camera. Ethan studied every photograph carefully, almost desperately, searching for traces of himself inside years he had never lived. Then he noticed one frame placed slightly apart from the others. A picture of Clara standing beside the twins last Christmas beneath cheap-colored lights hanging across the porch outside. Noah smiled proudly while holding a homemade paper star. Lily wore antlers tilted sideways on her blonde hair. Clara looked tired but happy. Ethan reached toward the photograph slowly before stopping himself halfway. He did not know if he had earned the right to touch memories he never helped create. A soft floorboard creaked behind him. Clara stood near the hallway entrance wearing the same knitted jumper from earlier, though her hair now rested loosely over one shoulder. You should try sleeping, she whispered softly. Ethan leaned back against the sofa. I forgot how loud silence feels. Clara studied him quietly for a moment before sitting carefully on the armchair opposite him. Warm lamplight softened the tired sadness in her face. You always hated being alone. Ethan gave a faint smile. And yet somehow I became very good at it. Silence settled gently between them again. Not uncomfortable anymore. Just honest. Clara folded one leg beneath herself while watching him carefully. The children wake up early, she warned softly. Noah believes 6:30 in the morning is practically lunchtime. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. That sounds exhausting. It is. Clara smiled faintly. But it is also strangely wonderful. Ethan looked toward the hallway again instinctively. I missed all of it. Clara's expression softened immediately hearing the grief in his voice. Ethan rubbed one hand slowly across his face before speaking again. I do not know how to process this. You do not have to process everything tonight. That is the problem. He looked at her carefully now. I lost 6 years in one evening, Clara. The emotion in his voice made her eyes lower briefly. Ethan stood slowly from the couch before walking toward the kitchen window. Early dawn had begun touching the edges of the sky outside with pale gray light. Do you know what keeps replaying in my head? He asked quietly. Clara shook her head once. You standing outside my office building in the rain while pregnant. His jaw tightened painfully. And me upstairs discussing stock prices. Clara wrapped her arms gently around herself. You did not know. Ethan turned toward her sharply. I should have known. The force of his own guilt surprised even him. Clara stayed quiet while he continued. I was supposed to love you enough to notice something was wrong. His voice lowered. Instead, let other people explain you to me. Clara looked down at her hands for several seconds before finally speaking softly. Do not rewrite history into something simpler than it was. Ethan frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means we were both young, proud, hurt. She lifted her eyes toward him again. You made terrible choices. But I also stopped fighting eventually. Ethan shook his head immediately. You should not have had to fight for basic loyalty. Clara smiled sadly. Maybe not. But love becomes very lonely when only one person is defending it. The honesty in her words settled heavily through the room. Ethan turned back toward the fading darkness outside because he could not bear the truth in her expression. For years he believed ambition made him strong. But now he understood something devastatingly simple. Real strength would have been standing beside Clara when protecting her became inconvenient. A small sound suddenly echoed from the hallway. Tiny footsteps. Seconds later, Noah appeared rubbing sleepy eyes while dragging Mr. Waffles behind him across the floor. Ethan immediately straightened instinctively. Noah blinked slowly at him beneath messy blonde hair. Why are you awake? The little boy asked. Ethan smiled faintly. I was about to ask you the same thing. Noah climbed onto the sofa without answering directly before pulling the blanket around himself like a cocoon. Mom says grown-ups stay awake when they are worried. Ethan glanced briefly toward Clara, who looked mildly embarrassed by the accurate observation. Your mother is very smart, Ethan admitted quietly. Noah nodded confidently. I know. Clara stood slowly afterward. I will make breakfast. Can we have pancakes? Noah asked hopefully. Clara groaned softly under her breath. Absolutely not at 6 in the morning. Ethan surprised himself by speaking before thinking. I could make them. Clara stared at him in immediate disbelief. You nearly burned down our apartment making pancakes. That was years ago. You set off 2 smoke alarms. Noah looked between them curiously. You used to live together? Silence followed instantly. Ethan looked toward Clara carefully. The question hovered painfully in the room because children noticed connections adults tried hiding. Clara walked slowly toward Noah before sitting beside him on the sofa. A long time ago, she answered gently. Noah considered that seriously. Before we were born? Clara nodded once. Noah looked toward Ethan afterward with open curiosity instead of fear now. Were you happy? Ethan felt the question hit somewhere deep inside him. Clara looked away quietly toward the kitchen while dawn light slowly brightened the room around them. Ethan sat beside Noah carefully before answering honestly. Yes. His voice softened. Very happy. Noah seemed satisfied by that answer, but Ethan was not. Because sitting here now inside the warmth of Clara's modest home, surrounded by evidence of the family he should have fought harder for, Ethan realized the cruelest part of losing happiness was not the moment it disappeared. It was realizing years later that most of the damage had been caused by your own silence. Morning arrived quietly inside Clara's small house. Sunlight slipped gently through the kitchen curtains while the smell of toast and coffee filled the air, and for a brief moment Ethan almost forgot how complicated everything had become. Noah sat cross-legged on the living room floor, building something complicated from plastic dinosaur pieces, while Lily colored beside him with complete concentration, her small tongue resting slightly against her lip the way children did when trying very hard to stay inside the lines. Clara moved around the kitchen in soft silence, her blonde hair tied loosely above the collar of an oversized jumper. Ethan watched her from the dining table while his untouched coffee slowly cooled beside him. The ordinary beauty of the scene hurt more than any scandal ever could, because this should have been his life too. "You are staring again," Clara said softly without turning around. Ethan blinked once before lowering his eyes. "Sorry." Clara glanced back at him briefly, not angry. "Just tired. You used to do that when you were thinking too much." Noah suddenly looked up from the floor. "Mom says overthinking gives people wrinkles." Ethan smiled faintly. "Then your mother must think I am ancient." Lily looked up seriously from her coloring book. "You do have forehead lines." Clara laughed quietly under her breath while Ethan pretended to look offended. "Thank you for that brutal honesty." Noah grinned proudly. "Mom says honesty matters." Ethan's smile faded slightly hearing that because Clara had always believed truth mattered more than comfort, even when the truth hurt her. Especially then. His phone buzzed again against the table, breaking the softness of the morning. "Sebastian." Ethan answered quietly before the children could become curious. "What happened?" Sebastian sounded exhausted already. "The board meeting has become a disaster." Ethan leaned back slowly in the chair. "Explain." "Richard wants you to deny everything publicly until paternity testing is completed. Your mother agrees. The public relations team has already drafted language calling Clara an old acquaintance." Ethan's expression hardened immediately. Clara paused near the kitchen counter after hearing that. Noah looked toward him curiously from the floor. "Are you in trouble?" Ethan covered the phone slightly before answering gently. "Something like that." Clara quietly moved the children toward the dining table with plates of toast, while Ethan stood and walked toward the hallway for privacy. "Listen carefully," he told Sebastian in a low voice. "Nobody calls Clara an acquaintance. Nobody calls the children rumors. Nobody uses their faces, their names, or their mother's pain as strategy." Sebastian went quiet for a second. "Then what are you saying publicly?" Ethan looked back toward the kitchen where Clara handed Lily a glass of juice, while Noah argued passionately about dinosaur extinction theories. For years, his public statements had been written to protect markets, investors, reputations. This was the first one that needed to protect people. "I am saying the truth," Ethan answered. "That Clara Whitmore was wronged. That I failed to defend her 6 years ago. That 2 children were dragged into a story they never asked to be part of. And that anyone who publishes their photographs will hear from my lawyers before lunch." Sebastian exhaled heavily. "The board will say you are emotionally compromised." "No," Ethan said quietly. "For the first time in years, I am morally awake." After ending the call, Ethan remained still for several seconds. Then Clara appeared quietly beside him in the hallway. "The board wants you to deny them publicly." It was not a question. Ethan nodded once. Clara lowered her eyes briefly. "That would make things easier for your company." Ethan stared at her carefully. "Is that what you want?" Clara crossed her arms gently. "What I want stopped mattering to people a long time ago." The sadness in her voice settled deeply inside him. "It matters to me now," he said. Clara looked away immediately. "Do not make that sound beautiful, Ethan. It should have mattered before." The words cut through him because they were true. He had no right to turn one morning of courage into redemption. He had no right to expect applause for doing what he should have done 6 years earlier. "I know," he whispered. "No," Clara said softly, finally looking at him again. "I need you to really know. If you want to be part of their lives, you do not get to arrive like a storm and rearrange everything because guilt finally found you. Noah and Lily are not a second chance for your conscience." Ethan swallowed hard. "They are children," she continued. "They need consistency. They need safety. They need a father who appears on ordinary Tuesdays, not only during emotional emergencies." Ethan lowered his eyes. "Then tell me where to start." Clara's expression softened for half a second before she guarded it again. You start by not promising forever before you have survived a week. Before Ethan could answer, the front doorbell rang unexpectedly through the house. Clara frowned immediately. Nobody visits this early. Ethan moved instinctively toward the front window first. A black luxury sedan sat parked outside the small duplex beneath bright morning sunlight. His stomach tightened instantly. "Who is it?" Clara asked quietly. "My mother." The warmth in the house changed at once. Clara's face became still in the way it had at the gala, calm only because panic would cost too much. Ethan opened the door, but did not step aside. Victoria Calloway stood on the porch in an immaculate cream coat, sunglasses in one hand, rain still beating on the polished leather of her gloves though the sky had cleared. Her eyes moved past Ethan into the house behind him. "So it is true," she whispered. Ethan blocked the doorway. "You should have called. I came to see my grandchildren." Clara appeared behind Ethan at that exact moment. The second Victoria saw her, 6 years of damage stood silently between them. "Clara," Victoria said. "Mrs. Calloway." Clara's voice remained calm, but Ethan saw the small movement of her hand at her side, fingers pressing into her palm. Victoria looked toward the kitchen, where Noah and Lily had gone quiet. "I did not know about the children." Clara laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "You knew I was young, alone, humiliated, and pregnant with fear. That was enough to be careful. You chose to be cruel instead." Victoria's composure tightened. "I was protecting Ethan." "No," Clara answered. "You were protecting the version of him that made you proud." Silence followed immediately. Even the children sensed it. Noah slowly climbed down from his chair, Mr. Waffles tucked under one arm, while Lily stood close to Clara's leg. Victoria finally looked at Ethan. "You cannot seriously intend to involve these children in your public life." Ethan stared at his mother for several long seconds before answering. "They are not these children. They are my children. And the first thing I am going to do as their father is keep them out of my public life." Something changed in Victoria's face hearing the certainty in his tone. For perhaps the first time in Ethan's life, his mother realized control over him was slipping away. "I made hard choices," Victoria said quietly. "You may hate me for them now, but one day you will understand that families like ours do not survive by being sentimental." Clara's voice came softly from behind him. "Families do not survive without it either." Victoria looked at her then, really looked at her. At the oversized jumper, the tired eyes, the small kitchen, the children's drawings taped to the refrigerator, the school bags. Near the hallway. For years, Clara had been a problem in Victoria's memory. A scandal, a threat, an inconvenience. Now she was standing inside the life she had built from the ruins powerful people left behind. Lily suddenly tugged Clara's sleeve. "Mom." "Yes, sweetheart." Lily glanced uncertainly toward Victoria. "Is this the lady who made you cry?" The silence afterward felt enormous. Clara immediately knelt beside her daughter. "Lily, that is not polite." But Ethan noticed something unexpected happen then. Victoria's expression collapsed quietly. Not dramatically, just enough for the guilt underneath to become visible. Children had a way of removing all the elegant language adults used to hide from themselves. Not reputation management, not protection, not strategy. Just one simple question from a little girl who had seen her mother cry. Victoria swallowed carefully. "I think I deserve that." Noah studied her with serious blue eyes. "Mom says people can say sorry if they mean it." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "Your mother raised you very well." Clara looked away, uncomfortable with praise from the woman who once dismantled her life. Ethan stepped forward. "This ends now." Victoria frowned slightly. "What ends?" "The pretending, the manipulation, the belief that love is something to be managed when it becomes inconvenient." His voice stayed calm, but firm. "I am going back to Sydney today. I am facing the board. Richard is finished if he lied to me. And if the investigation proves he orchestrated the scandal, he will face more than professional consequences." Clara looked sharply at him. "Investigation?" Ethan turned toward her. "Not revenge. Truth." That distinction mattered. He could see it in Clara's eyes. Revenge would have been about his anger. Truth was about restoring what had been stolen from her. Victoria studied her son silently. "You are willing to risk your company for this woman?" Ethan looked toward Clara. She stood there in soft morning light with exhaustion beneath her eyes after years of raising twins alone. Not polished, not glamorous, just real. And suddenly Ethan understood how foolish his old world truly was. No, he answered. Quietly. I am willing to risk my comfort for my family. There is a difference. Clara inhaled softly after hearing that. Emotion flickered across her face before she looked away quickly. Victoria remained silent. Then, slowly, she opened her handbag and removed a folded envelope. She placed it on the small table near the door. What is that? Ethan asked. Victoria looked at Clara. The check. Or what remains of it. My assistant found the pieces after you left your apartment. I kept them. Clara stared at the envelope in disbelief. Why? For years I told myself I kept them because you insulted me by tearing it apart. Victoria's voice lowered. This morning I realized I kept them because it was the first honest answer anyone gave me during that entire scandal. No one spoke. Victoria looked at Clara, and for the first time, there was no command in her voice. I am sorry. Clara's eyes glistened, but she did not move toward her. I hear you. Victoria waited, perhaps expecting more. Clara gave nothing else. And Ethan loved her more in that moment because she did not confuse apology with repair. She did not rush to make the room comfortable for the person who had hurt her. She simply let the truth stand there, unfinished. A few hours later, Ethan returned to Sydney. He did not leave with dramatic promises. Clara would not allow it. He kissed neither her forehead nor the children's cheeks like a man claiming a family in one night. Instead, he crouched at the door and told Noah and Lily he would call after dinner if their mother said it was all right. Tonight? Lily asked. Tonight, Ethan answered. Noah narrowed his eyes with businesslike suspicion. What time? Ethan glanced at Clara. 7, she said quietly. Ethan looked back at Noah. 7. And if you forget? Noah asked. Ethan felt the question settle into him. Then I do not deserve the next call. Clara looked at him then, and something in her face softened. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the first small allowance of possibility. At 7 that night, Ethan called. He called again the next evening. And the next. Some calls lasted 3 minutes because Lily was tired or Noah wanted to show him a drawing of a dinosaur that looked suspiciously like a potato. Some nights Clara stayed off camera entirely. Other nights, she appeared only to remind the children it was bedtime. Ethan did not push. He learned the names of teachers, favorite cereals, bedtime stories, fears, allergies, and the exact way Noah needed his sandwich cut. He discovered Lily's saying when she was nervous. He learned Clara hated asking for help, but accepted it more easily when he offered without making her feel indebted. 3 months later, the public statement had become old news. Richard Holloway was under investigation. Victoria had not been forgiven, but she had started sending handwritten letters instead of instructions. Ethan had stepped down from 2 unnecessary committees and missed 1 televised interview to attend Noah and Lily's school art morning. He arrived early and stood awkwardly near the classroom door, holding 2 paper cups of coffee and 1 small bunch of supermarket flowers. Clara saw him from across the room and paused. You came, she said softly. Ethan nodded. It is Tuesday. For a second, Clara did not answer. Then she took one of the coffees from his hand. You remembered. I am trying to become the kind of man who does. Across the classroom, Lily spotted him and ran over with pain on both hands. Noah followed more slowly, pretending not to be excited. Ethan looked down at them and felt the old ache rise again, but it no longer arrived alone. Beside it came something steadier. Responsibility. Presence. The quiet courage of showing up again and again without demanding to be praised for it. Lily lifted a painting toward him. 4 people stood beneath a crooked yellow sun. Clara, Noah, Lily, and a tall man with dark hair. This time, the word beneath the 4th figure was not imagined in crayon from a child's hope. Dad. Ethan looked at the painting until his vision blurred. Do you like it? Lily asked. Ethan crouched slowly, careful not to touch the wet paint. I love it. Noah studied him seriously. Mom says love is a doing word. Ethan looked past them toward Clara. She stood near the classroom table, watching quietly with tears she did not hide this time. She is right, Ethan said, and for the first time, those words were not a confession, not an apology, not a beautiful sentence spoken too late. They were a promise he would have to keep tomorrow, and the day after that, and every ordinary Tuesday after. Because Ethan Calloway finally understood the lesson Clara had been living for 6 years. Love was never proven by power, money, or public declarations. It was proven in presence, in patience, in telling the truth when silence would be easier. In choosing people over pride, not once in a grand dramatic moment, but every day, quietly, until trust had somewhere safe to grow again.